The morning sun rose slowly over the desert, spilling its golden light across Dustwater's main street like molten fire. The light revealed everything it touched: the warped wooden boards of weather-beaten buildings, the faded paint peeling from storefronts, the glimmer of glass bottles behind the saloon windows. Long, harsh shadows stretched across the road, so dark and sharp they seemed like deep cracks in the earth itself. The air was dry and heavy, filled with the faint scent of horses, old smoke, and the iron tang of dust. It was the kind of morning that felt as if the world itself were holding its breath, waiting for something inevitable and terrible to unfold. Down the center of the street came a slow procession. The sound reached the townsfolk before the sight did. The rhythmic clop of hooves, the creak and groan of heavy wagon wheels, and the soft, mournful hum of a hymn sung off-key by an old woman at the back of the line. The black hearse appeared at last, pulled by two perfectly matched bay horses whose sleek coats gleamed even under the dusty haze. The carriage itself seemed ancient, its black lacquer chipped and faded. Each turn of its wheels sent up little clouds of reddish dust, and the wooden frame gave a tired groan as if it bore the weight of far more than a single coffin. Behind the hearse walked Nora Whitlow, every line of her body stiff and controlled. She wore the severe garments of a widow in mourning, her dress a stark and unyielding black against the pale, sun-bleached earth. A heavy veil concealed her face completely, hiding whether it was streaked with tears or hardened into stone. The townspeople had gathered on either side of the road. They didn't speak loudly, they didn't dare. Instead, they whispered to one another, their voices rising and falling like the dry desert wind that slipped through the cracked boards of buildings. Those whispers seemed almost alive, slithering through the air like tumbleweeds. "Look at her," hissed Mrs. Abigail Thornton, her wrinkled lips barely moving, walking so proper, so high and mighty. Her companion leaned closer to catch every poisonous word. "As if we don't all know the truth about her." Cold satisfaction gleamed in Martha Brennan's eyes as she fanned herself with a fraying handkerchief. "Cold as January frost," she agreed, voice sharp as a blade. "Poor Samuel Whitlow, God rest his soul. Shot in the back like a dog, they say. And her? Not a tear shed. I heard tell." She let the words trail off dramatically, making room for imagination to do its cruelest work. The whispers swirled around Nora like a storm. She heard them. Of course, she did. But she kept her chin high and her eyes forward, hands clasped tightly together inside her black gloves. Her pace never faltered. Tears, she had learned, were a dangerous luxury. In Dustwater, weakness was devoured faster than rain on desert sand. Tears would not save her. They would only give her enemies proof of what they already believed, that she was fragile, ready to be destroyed. Let them whisper. Let them judge. They knew nothing of the nights she had endured inside the walls of the grand Whitlow house. Nothing of the bruises she hid beneath layers of silk and lace. As the hearse rolled past the sheriff's office, Sheriff Tom McKenna stepped forward and tipped his hat respectfully. His was the only gesture of kindness Nora had received that day, and even it felt fragile, like a thread about to snap. In Dustwater, a wealthy widow without a man's protection wasn't powerful. She was prey surrounded by wolves eager to feast. Dustwater itself was no better than the people who inhabited it. The town sprawled across the valley like a festering wound. Buildings leaned under the constant battering of sandstorms. Signs hung crookedly, their paint faded to ghostly letters no one could read. To the east, the copper mine coughed thick black smoke into the sky. The stench of metal and burning coal drifted on the wind, choking everything it touched. The mine was the town's heartbeat, steady and relentless, feeding greed and misery in equal measure. At the town's center stood Dustwater Savings and Lone Samuel Whitlow's empire. The building's white-painted facade gleamed under the punishing sun like a field of bleached bones. It was a monument to prosperity built on foreclosures and broken dreams, and its shadow fell across every struggling soul in town. The procession climbed the hill toward the cemetery. The gate creaked open with a mournful sound, revealing rows of crude wooden crosses. Here and there, a polished stone marker glimmered, a rare privilege for those who could afford permanence even in death. The gravediggers had worked through the night, hacking a grave into the unforgiving, packed earth beside the Whitlow family plot. Sweat still gleamed on their foreheads despite the cool morning air. Reverend Josiah Hayes cleared his throat. His Adam's apple bobbed nervously above his damp, stained collar. "Dearly beloved," he began, voice quivering, "we gather here to commend our brother Samuel to the Lord's keeping." Nora barely heard the words, her eyes hidden behind her veil, fixed on the horizon. There, the jagged peaks of the Alorn Mountains rose like ancient sentinels, their blue-gray forms hazy in the distance. Somewhere beyond those mountains lay freedom, though she had never known its taste. She had been married off at 17, traded like livestock by her ambitious father. She had left one cage only to step willingly into another prettier, yes, but just as confining. The Reverend droned on, reciting a list of Samuel's supposed virtues: his business acumen, his generosity, his civic pride. Nora's hands clenched inside her gloves until her nails bit into her palms. Then she felt a sensation like ice water down her spine. Not the general weight of the crowd's stares, but something sharp and direct. Someone was watching her. Slowly, she turned her head, scanning the edges of the gathered mourners. There he was. A tall, broad-shouldered man stood apart from the crowd. His black duster coat hung to his boots, and a wide-brimmed hat shaded his face. He held the reins of a massive black stallion, whose coat gleamed like polished obsidian. While others fidgeted, whispered, or wept, he stood perfectly still, silent, watchful. His presence was like a shadow made flesh. The words, "ashes to ashes, dust to dust," fell flat in the air. The first handful of earth struck the coffin with a hollow, echoing thud. Nora stepped forward. Slowly, she let her own handful of dirt fall, the dry soil slipping through her fingers. Behind her, the crowd held its collective breath, waiting for a sob, a fainting spell, any sign of feminine grief. She gave them nothing. No tears, no waver in her voice, no collapse. As the mourners began to disperse, flowing back toward town like water seeking its level, Nora felt the man in black still watching her. She didn't know his name, but something about his presence sent a shiver through her equal parts dread and dangerous hope. Benjamin Cross, vice president of Dustwater Savings and Loan, waited until the last of the mourners began to drift away. He always did things this way, appearing when a woman was most vulnerable, when grief or fear softened her defenses. His gait was smooth and calculated, like a predator circling prey. Nora saw him coming through her veil. Even without seeing his face, she felt her stomach tighten with unease. Cross had vulture's eyes, sharp and greedy, and hands that always lingered a second too long when they touched anything: doors, coins, or women. "Mrs. Whitlow," he said smoothly, sweeping off his hat with exaggerated courtesy. His voice dripped false sympathy. "Please accept my deepest condolences on your tragic loss." Nora kept her chin high. "Thank you, Mr. Cross." Her voice was calm and colorless, giving nothing away. Cross leaned closer, lowering his tone so that only she could hear. "Samuel was a man of great influence. He will be missed by us all. But life goes on. There are matters that must be tended to, matters of great importance to the bank and to you." Behind them, a few stragglers lingered, whispering and staring. Nora could almost feel their hungry curiosity digging into her back. "The board will need to meet," Cross continued. "Decisions must be made about Samuel's holdings, the mortgage portfolio, and other delicate concerns." His breath was sour with tobacco, and something darker she didn't care to identify. Nora's gloved hands tightened slightly. "I trust those matters can be handled in the usual way," she said, forcing her tone to remain neutral. Cross's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Perhaps. But, you see, a woman alone? Well, it isn't seemly. These are treacherous waters, Mrs. Whitlow. Allow me to guide you through them." His words dripped with suggestion. Before Nora could reply, the man in the black duster moved. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply walked his massive stallion between Nora and Cross, his silent presence like a wall of iron. Cross faltered, forced to step back. His eyes met the stranger's gray meeting brown, and something unspoken passed between them. Whatever he saw there made Cross pale. He stammered out a hasty farewell and hurried toward town, his confidence scattered like dry leaves. Nora stood very still, her heart pounding. The silent stranger mounted his horse with fluid grace, never glancing back. He rode toward town, dust swirling behind him like a cloak. She memorized the set of his shoulders, the way he moved as one with his mount. In a place where words were cheap and dangerous, his silence spoke louder than any threat. By the time Nora returned to the Whitlow house, the sun had begun to set. The grand structure loomed at the end of Maple Street. 3 stories of imported lumber and glass, built as a monument to Samuel's wealth and ambition. Now, without Samuel, it felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum. The wraparound porch sagged under its own weight. Windows stared blankly out at the world like dead eyes. Nora entered the parlor, her footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The servants had been dismissed the day after Samuel's death. She couldn't afford to keep them, and she couldn't stand their pitying looks any longer. Every room was haunted by memories she wished she could burn away. The horsehair sofa, where Samuel had hosted his business associates. The drinks cabinet, where he'd fortified himself before visiting her bedroom with demands she dared not refuse. In the kitchen, she built a small fire and set water to boil. Tea had become her last ritual of comfort, a fragile defense against a world intent on breaking her. Outside, hoofbeats crunched in the gravel drive. Nora's head snapped up. Through the kitchen window, she saw 3 men dismounting. Edgar Hollis, one of Samuel's senior bankers, was at the center. His narrow face was pinched with calculation. The other 2 men flanked him like silent guards, their expressions grim. Nora's breath caught. They hadn't come to pay respects. They were assessing the house, assessing her. Without Samuel's protection, without a male heir, she was merely an obstacle standing between them and the fortune they desired. The law might technically say the property was hers, but Nora knew better. In Dustwater, laws were clay, easily reshaped by men with money and ambition. She pressed a trembling hand to her chest, forcing herself to breathe evenly as the men circled the house like wolves. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat by her bedroom window, watching the town below. Lights flickered in, and windows, then one by one went dark. The saloon's rickety piano played a sad tune, laughter mingling with occasional shouts. At the very edge of town, a single, lonely light glimmered. It came from the abandoned Baker cabin, a place long left empty after Apache raids years earlier. Someone was living there now. Someone who valued solitude more than society. Nora knew instinctively who it was, the silent stranger. His name came to her in a whisper, remembered from the general store. Jack Renner, a man who'd appeared out of nowhere, scarred, silent, and utterly alone. Expansion techniques used inner turmoil, added depth to Nora's fear and determination, especially in how she views Cross and the bankers. Rich setting details. The Whitlow house, the town, and even the sound of footsteps are described vividly to make readers feel immersed. Pacing slowed. Conversations are stretched with body language and subtext to build tension. Mystery deepened. Jack's role is made more enigmatic, his silence carrying a heavy presence. Jack Renner's name was always spoken in whispers, as if saying it too loudly might summon him like a ghost. Some townsfolk claimed he was a deserter, a man running from military justice. Others swore he'd been a Union scout who'd witnessed unspeakable horrors in the war, and had returned broken a shell of the man he once was. Nora remembered snippets of conversations overheard in the general store. Tracked his enemies for months, one grizzled miner had said in awe. Another replied in hushed tones. He played dead among his fallen comrades, waited until night, then crawled away with a bullet in his throat. Men like that don't come back the same. Whether the tales were truth or rumor didn't matter. They all painted the same picture. A man shaped by violence, solitude, and a silence that spoke louder than words. Nora, watching that lonely light from the abandoned cabin, felt an unexpected kinship. She too knew what it meant to be trapped, to be unheard, to hide scars beneath layers of propriety and fabric. She pressed her forehead to the cool glass of her window and whispered into the empty room, "You keep your secrets, Jack Renner. I'll keep mine." Sleep came late and restless. When it did, it brought unsettling dreams. In them, she heard the steady rhythm of a single horse circling the Whitlow house. The sound was neither chaotic nor hurried, it was patient, methodical, like a predator testing the edges of a cage. Nora woke several times, certain she truly heard hoofbeats in the waking world. But each time, the window revealed only silent streets and a sky littered with cold, distant stars. Near dawn, driven by some instinct older than reason, she rose and wrapped herself in a shawl. Peering through the window, she saw him. Jack sat astride his massive black horse at the corner of Maple and Main, motionless, watching. How long had he been there? Silent as a statue. What vigil was he keeping? She pressed her hand to the glass, heart pounding. But before she could move, the first rays of sunlight touched the horizon. Jack turned his horse without a backward glance and rode toward the wilderness, leaving only a swirl of dust behind him. That morning, Nora dressed carefully. She chose a gray dress, somber enough for mourning, but without the theatrical severity of full widow's black. It was armor, subtle yet firm, for the battles she knew were coming. There were accounts to settle, suppliers to pay, decisions to make. Samuel's death had freed her from one prison, but the bars of another were already forming around her. When she entered the bank, the change was immediate. Samuel's desk, once an untouchable symbol of power, now bore Benjamin Cross's greedy fingerprints. Papers were spread before him like battle maps, and he sat in Samuel's chair as though he had always belonged there. "Ah, Mrs. Whitlow," he said, standing with mock surprise. His smile was sharp, predatory. "How unexpected." Nora's spine stiffened. "I've come to review my late husband's holdings. There are matters only I can resolve." Cross's smile widened, showing too many teeth. Indeed. Though, unfortunately, I've discovered some irregularities." Her heart began to race. "Irregularities?" "Yes," he said smoothly, drawing out the word like a snake uncoiling. "Missing documentation. Questionable collateral assessments. Nothing we can't resolve, of course, but it will take time." He steepled his fingers. "A woman of your delicate sensibilities shouldn't trouble herself with such matters. Perhaps we can arrange a more suitable situation." Nora understood the threat beneath his polite words. Surrender the property. Accept whatever pittance they offered. Disappear quietly, or risk being crushed by accusations and scandal. She forced her voice to remain calm. "I will review the documents myself. My husband taught me to read contracts quite thoroughly." Cross's pleasant mask slipped, just for a second. "As you wish," he said coldly. "But remember, Mrs. Whitlow Dustwater is an unforgiving place for those who stand alone." Nora left the bank with her head high, though her hands trembled inside her gloves. Outside, the morning sun beat down mercilessly, and dust devils danced in the street like mocking spirits. She walked directly to Larson's general store. The bell above the door jingled sharply as she entered, a brittle sound in the tense air. Inside, she purchased flour, salt, and ammunition for the derringer Samuel had once given her for protection. He had never guessed she'd considered turning it against him. As she exited, her path was blocked by Jacob Thornton, the store owner's son. Whiskey clung to his breath despite the early hour, and his eyes gleamed with crude hunger. "Mrs. Whitlow," he slurred, swaying slightly. "All alone now, aren't you? A pretty woman like you needs looking after." His hand shot out, reaching for her arm. Nora recoiled, her heart hammering. Before she could react, a shadow fell across both of them. Jack Renner stood 3 feet away, his sudden presence as startling as a thunderclap. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His mere existence filled the space with a thick, suffocating tension. Enhancements in this section expanded Jack's mystique, added rumors and backstory snippets to deepen his legend and raise curiosity. Nora's inner world. Her fear, courage, and strategy are explored in more depth, making her a dynamic heroine. Heightened tension with Cross. Their conversation is stretched to emphasize the stakes and his manipulative power. Scene building. Sensory details like the dusty heat, jingling store bell, and whiskey breath make each moment vivid. Suspense escalation. Jacob's assault and Jack's sudden appearance deliver a sharp cliffhanger. Jacob Thornton's bravado crumbled under Jack Renner's silent stare. Jack didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even rest his hand on a weapon, yet his presence radiated danger like heat from a forge. The younger man stumbled backward, swallowing hard. I was just offering condolences, he stammered. His voice cracked, thin and pitiful. Without another word, he fled down the street, his boots kicking up frantic puffs of dust. Nora's breath came fast, her pulse wild in her throat. She turned to face Jack, her storm-gray eyes locking onto his. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack didn't reply. His face, hard as carved stone, gave away nothing. Only the faint tightening around his eyes betrayed a flicker of emotion. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture so subtle she almost missed it, then turned and walked away with measured, powerful strides. "Wait," Nora called, surprising herself. The single word hung in the dry air like a fragile bridge between them. Jack paused, though he didn't turn around. I wanted to say thank you," she repeated, more firmly this time. He continued walking without a backward glance, but she thought just for a moment that there was less tension in his stride, as though her gratitude had reached some hidden part of him. That night, Nora lay awake in the oppressive silence of the grand house. The rooms felt emptier than ever, the shadows stretching long and menacing across the walls. When sleep finally came, it brought a strange dream. She heard hoofbeats again, circling the house, not frantic or threatening, but steady, patient, like a heartbeat in the darkness. She woke with a start, certain the sound was real. Clutching the derringer, she crept to the window. But outside, the streets were deserted, the stars cold and indifferent above the silent town. As dawn approached, she glimpsed movement at the edge of town. Jack sat on his black stallion, motionless, watching her house from a distance. He didn't approach, didn't signal. When the first rays of sunlight touched the rooftops, he turned his horse and vanished into the wilderness, leaving only drifting dust in his wake. Nora pressed her palm to the glass, heart aching with an emotion she couldn't name. Was he guardian or predator? Savior or danger? Perhaps both. Later that morning, she dressed with precision, her gray dress fitted like armor. She pinned up her hair tightly, hiding the softness that men like Cross and Jacob Thornton would exploit. At the bank, she found chaos wrapped in the illusion of order. Benjamin Cross sat behind Samuel's massive oak desk as if it were a throne. Papers spread before him like a general's war plans. "Mrs. Whitlow," he said smoothly, rising with mock courtesy. "Your visit is unexpected." His eyes glittered with malice, thinly disguised as concern. "I have a right to review my husband's accounts," Nora said, her tone clipped. "There are decisions only I can make." Cross leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Indeed. But I've discovered troubling irregularities. Certain debts Samuel accrued before his untimely passing." Her stomach clenched. "Debts? That's impossible." Samuel was meticulous with his records. Cross's lips curved into a snake's smile. But even the most meticulous man can be careless in his final days. These debts must be resolved. If they aren't, he let the threat hang heavy in the air. "What are you implying?" Nora demanded, though her hands trembled inside her gloves. Cross stood, circling the desk like a predator closing in. "A woman alone has limited options. You could remarry quickly, transfer control to a husband who understands these matters." His eyes swept over her, possessive and oily. "Or you could entrust everything to the bank, for a modest settlement, of course." Nora's breath caught. The trap was clear. Surrender her independence, or be destroyed by whispers and false debts. She forced herself to stand tall. "I will review every document myself," she said coldly. "And I will not be intimidated, Mr. Cross. For a heartbeat." His mask slipped, revealing the rage beneath. Then he smiled again, smooth as oil. "As you wish. But remember, Mrs. Whitlow, Dustwater is a harsh place for those who stand alone." When she left the bank, her legs felt like water, but her spine remained straight. She would not let him see her break. Outside, the sun blazed mercilessly, baking the street into cracked patterns like shattered glass. Dust devils spun lazily between the buildings, mocking her fragile resolve. As she crossed the street, she caught a glimpse of movement in a narrow alley. Jack was there, shadowed and silent, his gray eyes following Cross's office window. The sight of him steadied her heart and raised 1,000 unspoken questions. Nora paused mid-step, her breath catching as she realized Jack wasn't looking at her. His gaze was locked on the second-story window where Benjamin Cross now stood, smugly surveying his domain. Cross's silhouette was unmistakable. Broad-shouldered, arms clasped behind his back like a king regarding his kingdom. Even at this distance, Nora swore she could feel his arrogance rolling off him like heat waves rising from desert stone. Jack's stallion shifted its weight, hooves scraping softly against the packed earth. Jack never took his eyes off Cross, his expression unreadable but his presence thrumming with barely contained menace. Nora wanted to call out, to ask him what he intended, but some instinct stopped her. Instead, she simply stood frozen in the street, torn between gratitude and terror. When she blinked, Jack was gone, vanished into the twisting alleys as silently as a shadow at noon. That evening, Nora prepared a simple meal. Tea, a scrap of bread, and the last jar of preserved peaches from her dwindling stores. She ate mechanically, hardly tasting a bite, her mind spinning with Cross's threats and Jack's watchful silence. As darkness fell, a knock came at her door. The sound was too sharp, too deliberate to belong to a neighbor or friend. Heart pounding, she opened it a crack. On the porch lay a small leather pouch. No note, no footprints visible in the dim light, just the pouch, heavy with some unseen promise. Nora knelt, her trembling fingers untying the leather thong. Inside gleamed gold coins, more wealth than she'd seen in one place since Samuel's death. Beneath the coins was a single scrap of paper with 2 words scrawled in blocky, awkward handwriting. "Leave tonight." Her pulse thundered in her ears. Who had left it? Jack? Someone else? The handwriting was clumsy, almost childlike, or perhaps deliberately disguised. She clutched the pouch to her chest, the weight of it pulling at her like gravity itself. If she fled now, she could vanish. Start a new life somewhere beyond the mountains, beyond Dustwater's poisonous reach. But running would also mean admitting guilt, allowing Cross to spin his narrative of the banker's widow who fled with stolen funds. Nora paced the length of her parlor, her skirts whispering against the polished floorboards. Every creak of the house seemed louder, every shadow deeper, as if the very walls were urging her to decide. Finally, she packed a small traveling case, a few changes of clothes, the Derringer, and Samuel's old journal, the only piece of him she had ever truly trusted. She was reaching for her cloak when the sound of hoofbeats shattered the night. Not one horse. Many. A thunderous, angry rhythm that made the windows rattle in their frames. Nora froze, breath caught in her throat. Through the curtains, she saw torchlight, a dozen riders charging up Maple Street like a wave of fire. At their head rode Benjamin Cross. His face, illuminated by the flickering light, was twisted with fury and triumph. "Mrs. Whitlow," he bellowed, his voice cutting through the night like a whip crack. "Open this door in the name of the law!" Panic surged. Nora grabbed the gold pouch, the Derringer, and nothing else. She darted to the back door, praying for escape. But 2 men waited there, grinning like wolves who had cornered their prey. "Going somewhere, widow?" one jeered, lunging forward. Before he could touch her, a gunshot split the darkness. The man spun and collapsed, clutching his shoulder. The second attacker whirled, raising his rifle only to be struck down by a blur of movement. Jack Renner emerged from the shadows like an avenging specter, his rifle butt smashing into the man's jaw with bone-cracking force. His storm-gray eyes met Nora's for one charged heartbeat. Then he jerked his head toward the alley, where his black stallion and a second saddled mare waited. "My things," she began, but Jack shook his head sharply, already moving. There was no time. Behind them, the front door of the house splintered under Cross's assault. His furious voice roared, "Find her! Bring her to me alive!" Nora gathered her skirts and ran. Jack boosted her into the mare's saddle before swinging onto his own horse. They rode hard through the sleeping town, the sound of pursuit growing louder behind them. Jack didn't take the main road. Instead, He led them into the maze of mining trails that snaked through the hills. Paths so narrow and treacherous, only someone intimately familiar with the land could navigate them. The moonlight cast jagged shadows on the rocks as the horses climbed higher and higher, carrying them toward whatever fate awaited at the end of this desperate flight. The trail grew steeper, with every turn, winding through jagged hills scarred by years of mining. The horses' hooves slipped on loose stones, sending tiny avalanches skittering into the darkness below. Nora clung to the saddle, her knuckles white, heart pounding so loudly she could hear nothing else. The cold night air burned her lungs, but she dared not slow. Behind them, distant shouts and torchlight flickered like malevolent stars. Jack rode slightly ahead, his black coat blending with the shadows. Even at a full gallop, he moved with calm precision, guiding his stallion as if they shared a single mind. When they reached a narrow switchback trail, he raised a hand, signaling her to slow. The horses began picking their way carefully through the treacherous path, every step a gamble between survival and disaster. Far below, torches still moved through the valley like fireflies. Cross's men had lost their trail, but they were spreading out, determined to find them. Jack dismounted silently and approached Nora's mare, checking the saddle girth with swift, practiced movements. This close, she could smell leather, smoke, and the faint, wild scent of pine clinging to his clothes. "Why?" she whispered before she could stop herself. The question hung between them, fragile and sharp. "Why help me?" Jack froze. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, he touched his throat and shook his head. Nora's brows furrowed. You can't speak?" His eyes, gray and storm-dark, held hers. In them, she saw confirmation, and pain so deep it seemed bottomless. He turned away abruptly, writing on a scrap of paper from his saddlebag. The words were rough, uneven, clearly hard for him to form. "Lost my voice. War took it." Nora's breath caught. The rumors had been true then. This man had been shaped broken by battle. Before she could ask more, a distant shout echoed up the canyon. Torches flared brighter. Cross's men were closing in. Jack crumpled the paper and gestured sharply for her to remount. There was no time for words, spoken or written. They rode again, pushing the horses harder, higher, until Nora's thighs burned and every breath came ragged and raw. The path narrowed to a barely visible trail, hidden between towering cliffs. From below, it would look like nothing more than a dead end. At last, they reached a plateau. Nestled against a sheer granite wall stood a small, sturdy cabin. Smoke still curled from its chimney, faint and silver in the moonlight. Nora swayed in the saddle, exhaustion slamming into her like a physical blow. Jack was at her side instantly, steadying her with a touch so careful it felt almost reverent. He led her inside the cabin. The interior was sparse but clean. A stone fireplace, a narrow bed, a table and 2 chairs. Shelves lined one wall, neatly stocked with preserved food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Everything here spoke of preparation and solitude. This was a place built for survival, not comfort. Jack guided her to the chair nearest the fire. Without a word, he built up the flames until warmth spread through the room. Then he disappeared outside. When he returned, he carried her small saddlebag, somehow rescued from the Whitlow house during their frantic escape. Nora stared at it, stunned. He had thought of her needs even while saving her life. "Thank you," she whispered, the words trembling. Jack only nodded, retreating to the far side of the room to give her space. She looked around, truly seeing the cabin for the first time. Here, surrounded by wilderness and secrecy, she was beyond Cross's reach, at least for now. But safety came with a terrible price. A widow alone, with a man not her husband, hidden away in a cabin. If anyone ever discovered this, her reputation would be shredded beyond repair. Then she thought of Cross's sneer, of Jacob Thornton's grasping hands, of Samuel's cold cruelty. What reputation remains to protect? Jack knelt by the fire, writing slowly on another scrap of paper. When he held it out to her, his eyes were steady, unflinching. "Stay here. Safe. They won't find us. How long? She asked, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. He hesitated before writing his reply. A month, maybe more. They'll watch the roads. We hide. We survive. The words on Jack's paper. A month, maybe more, weighed heavily on Nora. She sank back into the chair, staring at the flickering firelight as the reality of his warning settled like cold iron in her chest. A month in this secluded cabin. A month with a man she barely knew. A man feared and whispered about in town. Society would condemn her utterly if anyone discovered the truth. But what society had ever protected her? Samuel's wealth hadn't shielded her from bruises or humiliation. Cross's false politeness only masked his desire to control and destroy. Reputation, she realized bitterly, was nothing but another chain. Jack returned to his quiet work. He prepared strong coffee, set salted bacon to sizzle in an iron pan, and placed hard biscuits on a plate. His movements were precise, efficient, yet oddly gentle, like a soldier turned caretaker. Nora watched him through lowered lashes, fascinated by the contradiction of him, scarred and silent, yet capable of such thoughtfulness. When he slid the food toward her, she murmured, "Thank you." He gave a single nod, his expression unreadable. They ate in silence, the crackle of the fire and the whisper of wind through the chimney the only sounds. Afterward, exhaustion claimed her. Jack gestured to the narrow bed, then pointed at himself and the door. He would keep watch outside. Nora hesitated. The bed seemed too intimate, too revealing. But her body ached with weariness. She lay down fully clothed, Derringer within reach, and drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep. When she woke, afternoon light slanted across the floor. Jack sat at the table, cleaning his rifle with meticulous care. Beside the bed sat a basin of water and a folded towel, a small kindness that brought a lump to her throat. Over the next few days, they developed a rhythm born of necessity. Jack hunted, scouted, and reinforced their hidden trail. Nora tended the cabin, cooked meals, and began to find solace in simple tasks after years of enforced idleness. Each evening, they sat by the fire. Nora spoke softly about books she'd read, childhood memories, dreams of places she'd never seen. Jack listened with an intensity that made her feel truly heard for the first time in her life. When he wanted to ask questions, he wrote them on scraps of paper. His handwriting was awkward but careful, as if each letter cost him something precious. "Were you really in the war?" she asked one night, unable to hold back her curiosity. Jack went still, then nodded once. His jaw tightened, eyes clouding with memories too dark to share. "Is that where?" She gestured toward his throat. He nodded again, but before she could voice sympathy, he held up his hand sharply. Then he wrote, "Saved my life. Words would have gotten me killed." Nora stared at the message, struck by the raw truth of it. His silence wasn't just injury, it was survival. The fire crackled between them, throwing their shadows onto the rough-hewn walls. She realized that this man, feared by the town, was the only one who had ever truly protected her. On the 10th night, she woke to find him seated by the window, rifle across his knees. Moonlight silvered his profile, revealing lines of exhaustion etched deep into his face. "You need rest," she whispered, moving to his side. He shook his head and pointed outside. She peered through the narrow window slit but saw only swaying pine trees and endless darkness. "They're not coming tonight," she said, more to soothe herself than to convince him. "Please," she added softly. "Sleep. I'll watch." For a long moment, he studied her, mistrust warring with need. Finally, he nodded. Jack showed her how to operate the rifle, his hands brushing hers briefly as he demonstrated the loading mechanism. The brief contact sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with fear. He stretched out on the floor by the fire, refusing to take the bed. Even in repose, his body remained tense, ready to spring into action at the slightest threat. Nora sat vigil, the heavy rifle across her lap. Outside, the night seemed to hold its breath. She glanced at him often, watching the harsh lines of his face soften in sleep. For the first time, she allowed herself to wonder who he had been before violence carved him into the man he was now. Just before dawn, distant hoofbeats echoed faintly through the canyon. Nora's pulse leapt as she reached to wake Jack, knowing that their fragile sanctuary was about to be tested. Jack came awake in an instant, like a wolf roused from slumber. His hand shot to the rifle even before his eyes fully opened, and in the same motion, he signaled for Nora to stay low. Nora's pulse hammered. She crouched beside him, gripping the rifle he'd taught her to use, her breath coming in shallow, terrified gasps. Through the narrow slit of the window, Jack peered into the pre-dawn gloom. The first streaks of light revealed 3 riders at the canyon's entrance, their torches casting eerie orange halos. "Cross's men," Nora whispered. Though she already knew the answer, Jack didn't look at her. His gray eyes were like cold steel as he tracked every movement below. The lead rider's voice carried clearly on the still mountain air. "Spread out. She has to be up here somewhere. Double the reward if you find the widow alive." Nora's stomach twisted. Cross wasn't giving up. He would hunt her to the ends of the earth. Jack pressed her shoulder gently, his silent way of telling her to breathe. His touch grounded her, steadying the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. The riders dismounted, fanning out like a hunting pack. Their boots crunched on loose stone, every step echoing ominously through the narrow canyon. Jack moved like liquid shadow. One moment he was beside her, the next he'd melted into the darkness near the door. Nora's heart stuttered. For a terrifying instant, she thought he'd abandoned her. But then she saw the glint of his rifle barrel from a higher ledge outside. He was positioning himself above them, a silent guardian in the rocks. The first man rounded a boulder, torch raised high. He never saw the shot that struck him. The crack of Jack's rifle echoed like thunder, and the man crumpled silently to the ground. Panic erupted below. The others scrambled for cover, shouting curses and firing blindly into the cliffs. Nora clapped her hands over her ears, the sound of gunfire deafening. Smoke filled the air, acrid and stinging. Jack moved with deadly precision, his silhouette appearing briefly against the dawn sky before vanishing again. Each shot he took was deliberate, economical, and devastating. Within minutes, 2 more men fell. The survivors fled, dragging their wounded, their shouts fading into the distance. Silence descended, broken only by Nora's ragged breathing. Jack reappeared, descending the rocky ledge like some vengeful spirit. His coat was torn, his face streaked with soot, but his eyes burned with fierce determination. Nora rose on trembling legs. "They'll come back," she said hoarsely. "With more men. Cross won't stop." Jack nodded grimly, wiping his rifle clean with a rag. He scrawled a message on a scrap of paper. "We can't keep running. Must strike first." Nora stared at the words, the finality of them stealing her breath. "Strike first? You mean kill Cross?" His jaw tightened. "Not just Cross, his whole network. Evidence exists. Samuel kept records." At Samuel's name, Nora flinched. Memories of her husband's cruelty and secrets surged like a flood. "His study," she whispered. "There's a hidden safe behind his father's portrait." Jack's eyes sharpened. He gestured for her to continue. "The combination is March 15th, 1836, she said. "His mother's birthday. I never understood why he chose it." Jack wrote quickly. "If we get records, Brackett can help. Federal law. Real justice." The words sent a shiver through her. Real justice had always seemed like a fairy tale, but Jack's unshakable certainty made her want to believe. "You'd risk your life to go back there?" she asked softly. Jack met her gaze, storm-gray eyes filled with quiet intensity. He didn't write this time. Instead, he simply placed his scarred hand over hers. The answer was clear. In that moment, Nora knew. They weren't just running anymore. They were declaring war. The morning after the canyon attack was unnervingly quiet. No hoofbeats, no shouts, only the eerie stillness of snow settling on the mountain pines. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. Nora stood outside the cabin, shawl pulled tight against the biting wind. The cold stung her cheeks, but the chill inside her chest was colder still. She understood now. Dustwater would never stop hunting her unless she took action. Behind her, Jack emerged from the cabin carrying his saddlebags. His movements were deliberate. controlled. But there was a dangerous energy simmering beneath his calm exterior. He set his rifle down on the table and began checking supplies. Ammunition, dried meat, flint, and a coil of rope. Every motion was practiced, almost ritualistic, as though preparing for battle. Nora watched in silence, a strange mix of fear and admiration twisting inside her. This man, who had once been nothing more than a shadowy figure at her husband's funeral, had become her anchor in a storm. When he finished his preparations, Jack handed her a sheet of paper. His handwriting was rough, but the message was clear. Elias Parker coming today. Old friend. Trusted. Will help. Elias? Nora repeated, trying to imagine anyone Jack might call a friend. Jack nodded once, his expression softening slightly. Then he gestured toward the mountains, where a faint trail of smoke rose a signal, perhaps, or a warning. Hours later, the sound of hooves echoed through the canyon. A grizzled man rode into view, his buckskin coat tattered, beard streaked with gray. His eyes, sharp and wary, scanned the plateau before landing on Jack. "Jack Renner!" he called out, voice rough as gravel. "You damn ghost. Thought you disappeared for good." Jack met him halfway, clasping his forearm in a warrior's greeting. For a moment, some of the tension in Jack's shoulders eased. Elias dismounted and removed his hat when he saw Nora. "Ma'am," he said respectfully. "So, you're the widow causing all this trouble." Nora's lips curved into a humorless smile. "I've been called worse." Inside the cabin, Elias wasted no time. As Jack poured coffee, Elias leaned forward, his expression grim. "Cross is getting desperate. He spread lies from here to Denver, says you killed Samuel and ran off with a dangerous fugitive. He's even put a price on both your heads, $500, dead or alive." Nora's blood ran cold. "500, she whispered. That was enough to make every drifter, outlaw, and bounty hunter in the territory come sniffing after them. Elias nodded. "And that's not all. He's been stirring up the townsfolk, telling them you've lost your mind. Claims you're bewitched by Jack here, under his evil influence." His mouth twisted in disgust. "Man's got a poisonous tongue." Jack's fists clenched on the table, the muscles in his forearms standing out like cords. His storm-gray eyes burned with a promise of vengeance. Nora straightened, her fear hardening into fury. "He wants my property, my husband's holdings. If I'm dead or locked away, it all defaults to the bank." "That's right," Elias confirmed. "He's already drawn up the paperwork, just waiting to file it." Jack snatched a sheet of paper and wrote furiously. "We make him come to us. Our ground. Our rules." Elias raised an eyebrow. "That's bold. Dangerous. But it could work." Nora leaned over the paper. "What do you mean?" Jack wrote again. "You surrender publicly." Cross distracted. "I go into town for records." Nora stared at him, horrified. "You want me to pretend to surrender?" "Jack, if Cross gets his hands on me." He didn't let her finish. His hands cupped her face, rough but gentle, his eyes locked on hers. She could feel the heat of his breath, the steady beat of his determination. He wrote a single word on the page, then turned it toward her. "Trust." Nora's throat tightened. She swallowed hard, then gave the smallest of nods. "I trust you," she whispered. Elias cleared his throat gruffly, clearly uncomfortable with the intensity between them. I need precise timing," he said. "And a neutral meeting place. Widow's Creek Crossing, maybe. Cross'll want plenty of witnesses." Jack's mouth curved into the faintest ghost of a smile. He tapped the word trust again, then began sketching a crude map of their plan. As the firelight flickered over their faces, Nora realized that this wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a war for truth and for the fragile, unexpected bond she and Jack had forged in the wilderness. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. Jack moved with tireless purpose, mapping escape routes, reinforcing the hidden trail to the plateau, and teaching Nora hand signals they could use during the confrontation. Nora studied each signal carefully, committing them to memory. Every gesture, every flick of his fingers, might mean the difference between life and death. At night, she and Jack sat close by the fire while Elias worked on his own plans nearby. The glow lit Jack's face in golden shadow, and Nora found herself memorizing the curve of his jaw, the determined line of his mouth. One evening, as a snowstorm howled outside, Nora finally asked, "Why risk so much for me? You could leave, disappear into the wilderness, where no one would find you." Jack froze, then reached for his slate. His hand trembled slightly as he wrote, "Because you didn't look at me with fear. Not once." Her throat tightened. "Everyone else sees a monster," she whispered, "but I never did." His gray eyes softened. The storm within them momentarily calmed. He didn't write another word. Instead, he simply reached across the space between them and took her hand, their fingers twining together. By dawn, the snow had stopped. The mountains lay blanketed in white, a pristine mask hiding the violence to come. Elias rode into town with a carefully crafted message for Cross. He spoke loudly at the saloon, ensuring the entire town heard. Nora Whitlow was ready to surrender on her terms. Cross took the bait eagerly. His reply came swiftly, carried by one of his riders. A public surrender at Widow's Creek Crossing, 5 days hence. Cross would bring the territorial marshal and 5 armed men. Nora could bring one companion of her choosing. When Elias returned with the news, Jack's face became a mask of grim determination. He wrote, "He's overconfident. That's good for us." The days leading up to the meeting were agonizing. Nora forced herself to remain calm, practicing her role in the deception. She would act defeated, terrified just enough to sell the illusion without betraying their true plan. Jack prepared differently. He cleaned his weapons with reverent care, sharpened knives until they gleamed like slivers of moonlight, and packed Samuel's documents into a waterproof satchel for his mission into town. The night before the meeting, he and Nora barely slept. They sat side by side, maps spread before them, whispering through the details one final time. When midnight came, Jack rose and dressed in dark clothes suited for stealth. His pack was light but deadly. Rope, grappling hook, spare ammunition, and the satchel. Nora helped fasten the straps with trembling hands. "Promise me you'll come back," she whispered. Jack paused, then cupped her face in his rough, scarred hands. His lips brushed hers in a kiss filled with both promise and desperation. When he pulled back, he mouthed the words silently. "Always." He slipped into the night like a shadow, leaving her standing in the doorway with tears burning her eyes. Morning came far too soon. Elias arrived to escort Nora to Widow's Creek Crossing. She wore her gray traveling suit, her posture perfect, her face a mask of calm. Inside, she was a storm of fear and determination. Every heartbeat felt like a countdown. Widow's Creek Crossing lay beneath a ridge of dark pines, the frozen stream cutting through like a scar. Cross and his men waited there, their horses stamping and snorting in the cold. Benjamin Cross's smile was a knife as he tipped his hat mockingly. "Mrs. Whitlow, so good of you to see reason at last." "I came to hear your terms," Nora replied, her voice steady despite the quaking of her knees. "Simple enough," Cross said smoothly. "Sign these papers transferring all holdings to the bank, and you'll be escorted safely to the capital for trial. I'm sure a jury will be understanding about a woman's desperate actions." Nora's gaze swept the papers without touching them. "And if I refuse?" Cross's smile widened. "Then you'll be a fugitive resisting arrest. And in such cases," his voice dropped, oily and cruel, "accidents happen." At that exact moment, a distant crack split the air. A rifle shot, sharp and unmistakable. Then another. All heads turned toward town. Smoke rose on the horizon, and faint shouts carried on the wind. Cross's composure shattered. "What the hell?" he snarled, spinning to glare at his men. Elias chuckled darkly. "Looks like someone just stirred up a hornet's nest back in Dustwater." Chaos erupted. Cross's men scrambled for their horses, shouting orders as more gunshots cracked in the distance. The once pristine morning air filled with smoke and the metallic tang of fear. "Seize her!" Cross roared, his composure gone. "She's been playing us for fools." Elias shoved Nora behind him, his Winchester already raised. "Run!" he barked. "Get to the trees." Nora gathered her skirts and sprinted for the tree line as bullets tore up chunks of frozen earth around her. Her lungs burned, the icy air slicing like knives, but she didn't dare look back. Behind her, Elias's rifle thundered. One of Cross's men went down with a scream, buying her precious seconds. As she reached her mare, Nora heard a voice raw and broken, but unmistakable. "Nora!" She spun, stunned. Jack burst from the pines astride his black stallion, Samuel's satchel strapped to his chest. His face was streaked with soot, his coat torn, but he was alive. "Jack!" she cried, tears blurring her vision. He swung down from the saddle, grabbed her hand, and hauled her onto the mare's back with effortless strength. "Go!" he rasped, his damaged throat tearing at the word. They rode hard for the far ridge. Behind them, Cross's men gave chase, their gunfire a deadly hail. Elias fell back, firing steadily to slow the pursuit. His curses rang out over the gunshots, fierce and defiant. Nora clung to Jack's waist as their horses leapt icy streams and dodged jagged rocks. The world blurred into white snow, black trees, and the pounding of hooves. When they crested the ridge, Jack signaled sharply. Nora slid from her horse and ducked behind a fallen log, fumbling for the derringer in her cloak pocket. Cross appeared moments later, his horse foaming with effort, his eyes wild. He dismounted, gun raised, and advanced like a predator who smelled blood. "It ends here, widow," he snarled. "You thought you could destroy me? I own this town, this territory. You're nothing without me." Nora rose slowly, her derringer steady despite the tremor in her hands. "No, Cross. You're nothing without fear. And I'm done being afraid." He laughed, harsh and ugly. "You don't have the spine to shoot me." A shot rang out, but it wasn't hers. Jack emerged from the trees like a phantom, his rifle smoking. The bullet grazed Cross's arm, sending him sprawling with a howl of rage. Cross fired wildly, forcing Jack to dive for cover. Snow exploded where the bullet struck, stinging Nora's face. Heart hammering, she aimed carefully. Time seemed to slow. She saw every detail. Cross's twisted snarl, the rise and fall of his chest, the trembling barrel of his gun. "For Samuel," she whispered, thinking not of her cruel husband, but of the innocent townsfolk who had suffered under Cross's rule. She pulled the trigger. The derringer's small report sounded almost delicate amid the chaos. Cross staggered backward, disbelief etched across his face. "You," he gasped, clutching his chest as blood bloomed scarlet against the snow. "A woman." "Yes," Nora said fiercely. "Me." He collapsed, the last breath rattling from his throat. Silence fell, heavy and absolute. Jack limped toward her, his gray eyes blazing. His hands framed her face for one trembling moment before he drew her into a fierce, wordless embrace. Elias emerged from the trees, battered but grinning through bloodied teeth. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "The widow did it herself." Nora clung to Jack, tears mingling with laughter. The satchel thumped against her hip, the evidence they'd risked everything to retrieve. They had survived the storm, but Dustwater's reckoning was just beginning. The silence after Cross's death was deafening. Even the wind seemed to pause, as though the land itself held its breath. Nora stood rooted to the snow, her derringer still raised, her body trembling with the enormity of what she had done. Jack's hands covered hers gently, lowering the weapon. His gray eyes searched her face, filled with pride, relief, and something deeper, a vow unspoken. "You're safe now," he rasped, the words raw and jagged, tearing from his damaged throat. For a moment, Nora couldn't answer. Then she collapsed against him, sobs racking her slender frame as he held her close, his own body shaking with the aftershocks of battle. Elias gave them space, turning his attention to the satchel Jack had risked so much to retrieve. He opened it carefully, whistling low at the contents. "Sweet mercy," he muttered. "Samuel kept everything. Bribes, forged deeds, murder payments, this'll hang half the territory." Nora wiped her tears, her grief hardening into determination. "Then we use it. Cross tried to destroy me with lies. We'll destroy him with truth, and everyone who stood with him." They rode back toward Dustwater slowly, cautiously. The town's silhouette rose against the winter sky, smaller now, stripped of its illusion of power. Word of Cross's death had spread ahead of them like wildfire. By the time they reached the outskirts, townsfolk lined the streets, whispering, pointing, their faces a mixture of awe and shame. Marshal Brackett himself met them at the courthouse steps. A tall man with weathered features. His sharp blue eyes swept over Nora and Jack, then the satchel. "Is it true?" he asked quietly. Nora handed him the evidence with steady hands. Every word. Cross was the spider at the center of a web of corruption. Samuel's records will prove it. Brackett flipped through the papers, his expression hardening with each page. This is enough to bring down judges, legislators, even the land company in Denver. The whole rotten system. Jack's fingers brushed Nora's as he handed over the last document. It was a silent reassurance. We've done it. It's over. The trial that followed became the most sensational event in Dustwater's history. Witnesses came forward, emboldened by Cross's fall. Farmers spoke of being cheated out of their land, widows of being threatened into silence, miners of deadly accidents, covered up for profit. Nora took the stand with her head high. Cross's allies tried to paint her as a fallen woman, a temptress who had bewitched a damaged soldier into doing her bidding. She faced them without flinching. "I lived with Jack Renner without benefit of marriage because those sworn to uphold the law would have destroyed me," she declared. Her clear voice carried through the packed room. "If that makes me fallen, then I embrace the fall, because he saved my life when none of you would." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Some condemned her. Others applauded softly, hope dawning in their eyes. Jack's testimony came next, delivered through Elias, reading his carefully written words. The old trapper's voice was rough but steady as he spoke of war, loss, and the quiet courage of the woman beside him. By the trial's end, the gallery was in uproar. Judge Hammond and several legislators were sentenced to decades of hard labor. The land company executives fled Denver under federal warrants, their empire crumbling. Dustwater Savings and Loan was seized by the government and repurposed as a town hall and school, a symbol of rebirth rising from corruption's ashes. When the final gavel fell, Nora and Jack stood hand in hand outside the courthouse. Snowflakes drifted down, soft and clean, erasing the last traces of bloodshed from the streets. "You're free now," Elias said, his grizzled face breaking into a rare smile. "Both of you." Nora turned to Jack. "Free," she echoed softly. The word tasted strange and wonderful on her tongue. Jack cupped her face, his voice low but clear. "Home." He said a single, perfect word filled with promise. Tears blurred her vision. "Yes," she breathed. "Home." They didn't return to Samuel's grand house on Maple Street. Nora refused to step foot in those haunted halls ever again. Instead, she signed the property over to the town, instructing it to be used for a school and hospital. The people, humbled and grateful, began to rebuild not just the town but their faith in each other. Dustwater was no longer a kingdom of fear. Nora and Jack rode west, leaving the past behind. Their destination was unknown. Perhaps California. Perhaps a quiet valley, where no one knew their names. As the sun set, painting the mountains gold, Nora looked back one final time. Dustwater lay small and distant, like a bad dream fading with dawn. Jack's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining. No words were needed. Their journey was no longer about escape. It was about beginning again. Together, they rode toward a horizon bright with possibility, their love a quiet triumph over the darkness that had once bound them. A year passed, and the harsh winter that had once brought fear now ushered in a season of renewal. Snow blanketed the mountains like a soft quilt, not as a shroud, but as a promise of spring beneath. In the valley west of Dustwater, a small homestead stood nestled between two gentle hills. Smoke curled lazily from its chimney, the smell of fresh bread drifting through the frosty air. Nora stood at the window, her dark hair braided neatly, watching the horizon. In her arms, she cradled a sleeping infant, a daughter whose soft breaths were the sweetest sound Nora had ever known. Jack entered quietly, carrying a bucket of water from the well. His coat was worn, his hands roughened from honest work, but his eyes were clear, the storm within them finally at peace. When he saw Nora and their baby, his entire face softened. He crossed the room in 3 strides and kissed them both. his touch reverent, almost awed. "She looks like you," Nora said softly, brushing a fingertip over the baby's downy hair. Jack shook his head with a rare, quiet laugh. His damaged voice rasped, but the words were clear. "Strong like you." Nora's heart clenched with love so fierce it hurt. There had been a time she'd believed she would never have a family, never know what it felt like to be cherished. Outside, a wagon approached, its wheels crunching over the snow. Elias Parker's familiar figure guided the reins, his weathered face split by a grin when he spotted them at the door. "Well, look at you two," Elias said as he stomped the snow from his boots. "Thought I'd find a couple of wild hermits, but this looks downright civilized." Nora laughed, handing the baby to Jack so she could hug their friend. "We owe you more than we can ever repay." Elias waved off, her gratitude. "Bah, you gave me hope. Same as this whole town." His expression grew serious. "Speaking of which, Dustwater's thriving. School's up and running, hospital too. Folks finally working together instead of tearing each other apart." Nora's eyes shone with tears. "That's all I ever wanted, to make something good out of all that pain." Jack handed the baby back to Nora, then disappeared into the back room. When he returned, he held a small wooden horse, carefully carved, its details intricate and loving. He placed it in Elias's calloused hand. No words were needed. The gesture spoke of thanks, of friendship forged in fire and blood. As they sat by the hearth, Elias shared news of the wider world. Marshal Brackett had been promoted for his role in exposing Cross's network. The territory was slowly becoming a place of law rather than lawlessness. "Funny thing," Elias said with a chuckle. "Some folks call you heroes now." Nora blinked, startled. "Heroes? We were just trying to survive." "Sometimes," Elias said wisely, "surviving is the bravest act." After Elias departed, Nora stood on the porch, rocking her baby as the sun set behind the mountains. The sky burned gold and crimson, a reflection of all they had endured and overcome. Jack joined her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. They watched the horizon together, their daughter nestled safely between them. "Remember the night we fled Dustwater?" Nora whispered. "I thought it was the end of everything." Jack's hand tightened on hers. His voice, though still rough, held steady warmth. "It was the beginning." She smiled through her tears. "The beginning of us." From their porch, they could see the schoolhouse in the distance, its windows glowing with lamplight. Children's laughter carried faintly on the crisp air, a sound of hope reborn. Nora kissed her baby's head, inhaling the sweet, milky scent. "She'll grow up knowing none of the darkness we faced. That's what matters." Jack pressed his lips to Nora's temple, his silent vow sealing her words. As night fell, the stars emerged one by one, scattered across the velvet sky like blessings. In that quiet moment, Nora felt the last remnants of fear slip away. They had been hunted, broken and scarred. But love had turned their wounds into something strong, something enduring. And as they stood together beneath the endless sky, Nora knew with absolute certainty that whatever lay ahead, they would face it as they always had, side by side, unflinching, alive.